Hello everyone, and welcome to Relax for a While. I'm Joanne, and I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. If you're new to the channel, a warm welcome to you. In tonight's video, we're gonna get cozy with the Maida series as we immerse ourselves in a sleepy audiobook from the second book of the series, Maida's Little House, accompanied by the soothing sounds of rain. This sleepy audiobook and ASMR magic will help transport you to a peaceful state of mind, perfect for unwinding after a long day. We'll embark on a magical journey with a little girl named Maida and all of her friends while they spend a happy summer together in a quaint little house in the country that has everything a child could wish for. Before we begin, I recommend keeping the volume at a lower level. This will help create a calming atmosphere that can lull you into sleepiness. With the soft sounds of my voice and the gentle rain in the background, a lower volume will make the experience even more soothing and help you relax more deeply. So, adjust your volume to a comfortable, quiet level, settle in, and let yourself be carried away by the story and the tranquil rain sounds. Now, go ahead and close your eyes. Take a slow, deep, comfortable breath. Hold it for a moment and exhale slowly. Feel the tension melting away from your body as you prepare to drift off into a world of wonder and imagination. And so, my friend, lay back, relax, and let the soothing narration and calming sounds lull you into a peaceful sleep. Chapter 1, The Homecoming. "I wonder when Maida's coming back," said Rosie Brine, as she approached the trio of children who sat on the Lathrop lawn. The three were Laura Lathrop, her brother, Harold Lathrop, their friend, Arthur Duncan. Rosie did not join them on the grass. She seated herself in the hammock behind them and began to swing, first slowly, then so violently that her black curls swept back and forth with her swift progress, and her speech came in jerks. "I wouldn't mind how long I had to wait, if I only knew when she was coming." Nobody answered. Rosie had only asked a question that they all asked at intervals, hoping against hope that somebody would make a comforting guess. "I don't believe she's ever coming back," Rosie answered herself, recklessly, swinging almost over their heads. Arthur Duncan, a big, broad-shouldered boy with tousled thick brown hair beating down over his forehead and almost veiling his eyes as steady as they were black, answered this. "Oh, Maida's comin' home sometime. She promised, and she always keeps her promises." "When we were going to school," put in Laura Lathrop, "it was bad enough. But we didn't have time to miss her so much then. But now that school's over and there's nothing to do, oh, how I wish she were here." "Well, what good would it do?" Harold Lathrop asked. Harold and Laura looked much alike, although Laura was slim and brown-haired, and Harold flaxen and a little stout. But both had blue eyes and small, regular features. "We wouldn't see anything of her," Harold continued. "She'd be going away somewhere for the summer, and we wouldn't have a chance to get to know her until fall." Maida would never do that, Rosie Brine declared emphatically. She'd manage some way to be with us for a while. She brought the hammock to a stop for a moment, with the swift kick of a determined foot against a tuft of grass. There is one thing I am sure of, and that is that Maida would never forget us or want to be away from us. She says that in every letter I've got from her. Well, what are we going to do today? Harold demanded. I should think from the way we sit here that we had not been counting up the days to vacation for a month. Why, Laura's even had the hours all numbered out on her calendar, so she could draw a line through them every night. I wanted to have the minutes marked out too, Laura admitted, but it took too much time. What are we going to do? Harold persisted. Here it is, the first day of vacation, and we sit here saying nothing. You think of something, Arthur. You always can. Arthur Duncan rolled over face downwards on the grass. I can't think of anything to do this morning, he admitted. It's so hot, and I feel so lazy. Seems to me I'd just like to lie here all day. It was hot that late June day in Charleston. Not a breeze stirred the shrubs of the Lathrop lawn. The June roses drooped, the leaves seemed wilting. Even the blue sky looked thick and sultry. Huge white clouds moved across it so lazily that it was as though they too felt general languor. The children look as children generally look at the close of school, pale and a little tired. Their movements were listless. Just outside the gate of the Lathrop place was Primrose Court, a little court lined with maples and horse chestnuts, with shady little wooden houses set behind tiny gardens, in their turn set within white wooden fences. At one corner of Primrose Court and Warrington Street, set directly opposite a schoolhouse, was a little shop, and over the shop, printed in gold letters against a background of sky blue, hung a sign which read, Maida's Little Shop. In Primrose Court, the smaller children were playing as briskly as though there was no such thing as weather. Brown-eyed, brown-haired, motherly Molly Doyle, quick, efficient but quiet, was apparently acting as the wife and mother of an imaginary house. Smaller and younger Timmy Doyle, her brother, a little pop-eyed, browny little boy, slow-moving and awkward, was husband and father. There were 4 children in this make-believe household. Quite frequently, little Betsy Hale, slim, black-eyed and rosy-cheeked, and a little Delia Dorr, chubby and blonde with thick red curls, attempted to run away, were caught and punished with great thoroughness. Apparently, Dorothy and Mabel Clark, twin sisters, one the exact duplicate of the other, with big round blue eyes and long round golden curls, were the grown-up daughters of this make-believe family. They were intent on household tasks, thrusting into an imaginary stove absolutely real mud pies, and sweeping an imaginary room with an absolutely real dustpan and brush. Aside from this active scene, everything was quiet. Farther down the court, doves had settled, were pink-toeing about, feeding busily, preening and cooing. Sometimes, Laura said thoughtfully, I feel as though I had dreamed Maida. If the little shop were not here with her name over the door and all of you talk about her with me, I should believe I had just waked up. She stopped a moment. If it had been a dream, how mad I should be to think I had waked up. Do you remember how exciting it was when Maida first came to live over the little shop? Rosie exclaimed. I should say I did. It was Laura who answered her. Wasn't it wonderful when all that pretty furniture came for their rooms? Yes, and the canaries, and the great geraniums for the windows, Rosie added eagerly. The most wonderful thing, though, Arthur went on, was when the sign went up. It was such a pretty sign. Maida's little shop, in gold painted on blue, and... Gee, how wild we all were to see Maida, Harold said. I don't know what I expected, but I certainly was surprised when Maida appeared. Lame, Arthur concluded for her, like Dickie. But they're both all right now. Dickie certainly is, and Maida was when she left for Europe. I often think, Harold began again after a little pause, of when we first met her, and she used to talk of the things her father gave her. We thought she was telling lies. I never thought she was telling lies, Rosie expostulated. I loved her too much for that. I knew Maida wouldn't tell lies. I thought she just dreamed those things. I remember them all. Her mother's mirror and brush and comb of gold with her initials and diamonds, and the long string of pearls that she used to wear that came to her knees, and a dress of cloth of gold trimmed with roses and a diamond, like a drop of dew in the heart of every rose. Yes, and the peacocks at her father's place, some of them white, Arthur interrupted. And don't you remember, Harold went on, we all thought she was crazy when she said that once he gave her for a birthday present her weight in $20 gold pieces. And a wonderful birthday party, Laura added eagerly, with a maypole and a doll baby house big enough to go into and live. I don't wonder why we didn't believe it at all, Rosie declared with conviction. It sounds like a fairy tale. And then it turned out that she was the daughter of a great millionaire, and every word of it was true. Do you remember how we asked Mr. Westabrook at Maida's Christmas tree if it was all true, and he said that it was? I'd like to see those white peacocks, Dickie said dreamily. I'd like to see that doll baby house, Laura added wistfully. I'd like to see the gold comb and brush and mirror with the diamonds, Rosie declared, and that dress with the roses and the diamond dewdrops. I like to look at precious stones. I like things that sparkle. At this thought, she herself sparkled until her eyes were like great black diamonds in her vivid, brilliant face. I'd like to see that pile of $20 gold pieces, Harold said. Oh, I wish she'd come back, Rosie sighed. The sparkle all went out of her face, and she stopped swinging. A door leading into Primrose Court opened with a suddenness that made them all jump. A boy with big eyes, very brown and lustrous, lighting his peaked face and straight hair very brown and lustrous, framing it, came bounding out. He ran in the direction of the group on the lawn, and as he ran he waved something white in his hand. The doves flew away before him in a glittering V. Hurrah! He yelled. Gee, how Dickie can run, Arthur Duncan exclaimed. Who'd ever believe that 1 year ago he was wearing an iron on his leg? Oh, what is it, Dickie? Rosie Brine called impatiently. Dickie had by this time reached the Lathrop gate. A postcard from Maida, he shouted. Does she say when she's coming home? Laura asked quickly. No, Dickie answered. He threw himself down among them, handed the postcard to Rosie, who had leaped from the hammock. It passed from hand to hand. Harold, the last one to receive it, read it aloud. Love to everybody. and how I wish I could see you all, was all it said. Nothing about coming home, exclaimed Rosie. Oh dear, how disappointed I am. Where's it from? Arthur asked, as though suddenly remembering something. London, Dickie answered. She told me that when she came home, she'd sail from England. Did she? Rosie asked listlessly. She never told me that. But you see, she says nothing of sailing. She's probably going to spend the summer there. I remember that she told me of a beautiful place they lived in one summer in England. She said that there was a forest not far from the house where Robin Hood and his men used to meet. Probably she'll go there. Rosie stopped for a minute, and then the listlessness in her voice changed to a kind of despair. I don't believe she'll ever come back. I know she will, Dickie announced with decision. The last thing Maida said was, I'll come back, and she always keeps her promises. I wouldn't be surprised if she came back this summer sometime, Arthur said. Anyway, I know she said they'd sail from England. Yes, but by that time we'll all be away, Laura's voice held a disappointed note. We're going to Marblehead in a week or two for the whole summer. And you're going to Weymouth, Rosie, aren't you? Rosie nodded. Only for 2 weeks, though. Where are you going, Laura? Asked Arthur. I don't know. When my father gets his 2 weeks vacation, maybe we'll take a tramp somewhere. That is, if it doesn't come after school has begun. And where are you going, Dickie? Laura went on. Nowhere. We're going to stay here in Charleston. Primrose Court will be my vacation. Mother says she'll try to take us to City Point or Revere or Nantasket every Sunday. Now what are we going to do today? We might go upstairs in the cupola and play games, Harold suggested. No, I don't want to stay in the house the first day of vacation, Rosie announced discontentedly. Let's play stunts, suggested Dickie, who, since his lame leg had recovered, could never seem to get enough of athletic exercise. Too hot, decided Laura. Hide and go seek, suggested Arthur. Too hot, decided Harold. Follow my leader, suggested Dickie. Too hot, decided Rosie. Hoist the sail, suggested Arthur. Too hot, decided Laura. Prisoner's base, suggested Harold. Too hot, decided Rosie. Tag, suggested Arthur. Too hot, decided Harold. Laura burst out laughing. Every game anybody proposes is too hot for somebody else. I say let's all face downwards and think and think and think until somebody gets an idea of something new that we can do. Everybody adopted her suggestion. The 4 on the grass turned over, lay like stone images carved there. Rosie turned over in the hammock. I wish Maida'd come home, came from her muffled accents before she, too, subsided. A whole minute passed. Nobody moved. Even Rosie kept rigid. Into the silence floated the note of a faraway automobile horn. It was not as much a call or warning as a gay caroling, a long level ribbon of sound which unwound itself continuously and, drifting on the soft spring air, came nearer and nearer. It stopped for a moment, started again, continued more and more gaily, ran up and down a trilled scale once more. The stone images stirred uneasily. The horn grew louder. In a moment it would pass Primrose Court. The horn ended in a high, swift call. The car stopped. The stone images lifted their heads. A girl, lithe but strong-looking with wide-apart big gray eyes gleaming in a little fat face, just touched in the cheek with pink, with masses of feathery golden hair hanging over her blue coat, was stepping out of the car. The images flashed upright, leaped to their feet. "It's Maida," Rosie Brine called as she sped like an arrow shot from a bow towards the automobile. "Oh, Maida! Maida!" "It's Maida!" The others took it up and raced into the court. Chapter 2: The Plan. "When did you land? Why didn't you let us know? How long are you going to stay? Did your father come too? Where's Billy Potter?" Maida tried to answer them all, to hug each of the girls who were hugging her all together, to hold out a hand to each of the 3 boys who seemed all to shake both her hands at once, to manage to kiss Betsy Hale, who, hearing the name Maida shouted, vaguely recalled that there had once been a Maida whom she loved, and who thereupon hung tight to one of her legs, to manage to kiss Delia Dorr, who had no remembrance of Maida, whatever but in imitation of Betsy, hung tight to the other leg, and in addition to call to Molly and Timmy and Dorothy and Mabel, who remembered her perfectly, who danced like little wild Indians on the outskirts of the crowd, yelling, "Maida's come back! Maida's come back!" at the top of their lungs. All this took much less time to happen than it has taken to describe, and it was suddenly interrupted by the rapid opening of the door to the dooryard. A little old Irish woman with silvery hair and with a face as wrinkled as a nut came rushing out, her arms extended, calling, "My lamb's come back! My lamb's come back!" Maida ran to her and hugged her ecstatically. "Oh, dear Granny Flynn," she said. "Dear, dear Granny Flynn." Then there appeared back of Granny Flynn Mrs. Dorr, Granny Flynn's daughter, Delia and Dickie Dorr's mother, who had to be met in the same affectionate way. Mrs. Dorr was a tall, brown, fresh-complexioned woman. It was from her that Dickie inherited his brown coloring, and Delia her sparkling expression. "I'd never know you for the same child," Mrs. Dorr said. Of course, the grown people claimed Maida's attention first. They showered her with questions, and she answered them every one with her all old-time courtesy and consideration. Was she well? Well, but look at her. When did she land? She had landed the day before in New York, had come on the midnight to Boston. Where was she living? At their home on Beacon Street. Would she stay to lunch? Yes, yes, yes. Her father had said that if she were invited, she could spend the whole rest of the day in Primrose Court. He would send the car for her late in the afternoon. Where was she going after that? Her father would tell them all this afternoon. He had some plans, but they weren't worked out yet. Would she be in Boston for a few days? Probably. Then, during that time, wouldn't she like to come back to her own rooms over Maida's little shop? Would she? Oh, goody. She could call her father to bring her some clothes. It went on and on until the older children stood first on one foot and then on the other with impatience, and the younger ones went back to their housekeeping game and their frequent punishments. But finally, the curiosity of this group of grown-ups was satisfied, and the children claimed their prey. A clamorous group, every one of them telling her some bit of news, and all at once. They made the tour of the court. They called on Mrs. Lathrop, who mercifully forbore to ask more than 5 minutes of questions, and on the Mrs. Allison, a pair of middle-aged maiden ladies. Here, the confusion doubled itself because of the noisy screams of Tony the parrot. Tony kept calling at the top of his croaking voice, "What's this all about?" Each of the children tried to tell him, but he was apparently dissatisfied with their explanations, for he only called the louder and with greater emphasis, "I say, what is this all about?" Finally, in despair, he exclaimed, "Good night, sweet dreams," and subsided. At length, the 6 of them, Maida, Rosie, Laura, Arthur, Dickie, and Harold, retired to the Lathrop lawn and plumped down on the grass. They talked and talked and talked. "How you have grown, Maida," Rosie said first. "How tall you are and strong-looking," she would have added, "and how pretty," if the boys had not been there, but shyness kept her from making so personal a comment in their presence. "That's exactly what I was thinking about you," Maida laughed. "But then you have all grown, Arthur particularly." In her candid, friendly way, she surveyed them one after another. "You are taller too, Laura, and I believe even your hair has grown." "It certainly has," Laura admitted. Laura's hair was extraordinarily long and thick. It hung in 2 light brown braids, very glossy, not a hair out of place, to below Laura's waist. At the tip of each braid was a big pale blue bow. "As for you, Rosie, you are still taller than I'm afraid." "Let's measure," Rosie answered, springing to her feet. The 2 girls stood shoulder to shoulder. Rosie, it proved, was a little the taller. Maida continued to look at her after they had resumed their places on the grass. "What a beauty she is," she thought, and she too was withheld by shyness and a sense of delicacy from making this comment before the others. Rosie was certainly handsome, tall, active, proud-looking, great black eyes lighted by stars, a mass of black hair breaking into high waves and half curls, cheeks as smooth as satin and stained a deep crimson, ivory white, jet black, coral crimson. That was Rosie. Maida had always called her Rose Red. "But the greatest change has come in Dickie and me," Maida ended. "We have both lost our lameness. You don't limp, Dickie, and I don't. Let's race to the gate and back." Dickie was on his feet in a minute. Arthur called, 1 to make ready, 2 for show. At the word "go," they were off. Dickie was more active, but Maida was taller. The race finished a tie. The blood which Maida's running brought to her cheeks painted roses there. Not the deep crimson roses which bloomed perpetually in Rosie's face, but transient blossoms, delicately pink. And under that flush, her face, a healthy ivory, looked well. Her big gray eyes were filled with happiness, and the torrent of her pale gold feathery hair seemed to gush from her head like living light. They sat and talked until luncheon, and immediately after luncheon gathered on the lawn and talked again. Maida still had questions to ask and comments to make. "You have all grown," she said once, "but somehow I think the little children have grown the most, and Dorothy and Mabel more than anybody. Their eyes still look like great blue marbles, and their hair as though it had been curled over a candlestick. Isn't it marvelous how they keep exactly the same height? Twins are magical creatures, aren't they? As for Betsy and Delia, They're great big girls. I suppose Betsy still runs away every chance she gets. On the whole, I think Molly and Timmy have changed the least. Does Timmy still fall into all the pud muddles? Molly still looks like a darling brown robin, and Timmy like a brown bogle. Don't you remember I used to call them Robin and Bogle? The children answered all her questions. Yes, Betsy still ran away. No, Bogle had quieted down. He didn't fall into pud muddles anymore. Of course, they had their questions to ask Maida about her year in Europe. And she told them of her experiences in Italy, Switzerland, France, and England. But though she answered them instantly, and with the fullness of detail which had always been her characteristic, it seemed at moments as though her mind were not all on what she was saying. Once or twice, she even interrupted herself to start something which had nothing to do with her subject. But apparently, both times, she thought better of it and checked a tongue which obviously was yearning to speed on in the interest of that unknown subject. "There's something you want to tell us, Maida," Dickie guessed, "but you won't let yourself." Maida blushed furiously, but her eyes danced. She did not answer. Rosie thereupon continued to watch her closely. "Maida Westabrook, you're almost bursting over something," she said once. "You've got a plan of some kind, and I know it." Again Maida blushed, and this time she laughed outright. "Wait and see," was all she said, however. After they had talked themselves out, they showed Maida the accumulated treasures of the last year. The wood carving, which was Arthur's accomplishment, and the paperwork, which was Dickie's, had improved enormously. The beautiful box of tools that Mr. Westabrook had presented to the one, and the big box of paints that he had given the other, were of course important factors in the improvement. Laura still danced beautifully, and she danced her latest dance for Maida, a Spanish fandango. Harold was raising rabbits, and he showed his entire family to Maida. At the urge of all this work, Rosie, who hated the sight of a needle, had taken in despair to knitting. She could endure knitting, she told Maida, because the work grew so fast. She herself said, though, that the less said about the results of her labor, the better, and Maida frankly agreed with her when she examined some of it. After this, the group returned to the yard for more talk. Somehow, they didn't feel like playing games. Late in the afternoon, they sprinkled the flower beds and hosed the lawn for Mrs. Lathrop. Then, as this made further sitting on the grass impossible, they retired to the tiny dooryard with its amusing little flower bed and its one patch of grass. There was just about room for their group there. They sat down. Again they asked Maida about her travels, but now Maida was truly absent-minded. Suddenly, in the midst of a description of Pompeii, there sounded a long, faint, faraway call of an automobile horn. It broke, like a fire rocket, into a flurry of star notes, then dropped a long liquid jet of sound which, again, like a fire rocket, dropped another shower of notes. The effect on Maida was electric. She came upright quivering. "That's Father," she said. "Now I can tell you what I've been biting my lips all morning to keep back. I didn't want to tell you until he was here to talk to your fathers and mothers. But, oh, we've got such a beautiful plan for the summer. Oh, it's so wonderful that it seems like a fairy tale." The long jet of sound lengthened, came nearer. Father wants you all to come to spend the summer with us at Situate. He's going to do the most beautiful thing you ever heard of in your life. Just as he gave me Maida's little shop, he's going to give me Maida's little house. He is going to live in the big house where he can have all the grown-up company he wants. And we are going to live in the little house. The little house is so far away from the big house that nobody would ever guess we were there. Oh, but it's all so beautiful, and there are so many things to tell about it that I don't know where to begin. For one thing, he's going to let us all help in. We girls are to do our part and the boys are to take care of oh, it's such a duck of a house, built very near a big pond and not so very far off the ocean. And there's a wood and house rock and the bosky dingle and, oh, I don't know how to tell you all about it. She stopped for breath. The horn came nearer and nearer. The 5 faces stared at her. For one astounded instant, nobody could speak. "Oh, Maida," at last Rosie breathed. The 2 girls threw themselves upon her. Arthur rose and then suddenly sat down again, but Dickie kept quite still, his eyes full of stars. "I knew you'd have some plan, Maida," he said. Harold, unexpectedly, turned a somersault. "I know I'm dreaming," Laura almost whispered. The horn stopped. A gray car turned into Primrose Court. A man, middle-aged, tall, massive, and with a pronounced stoop to his shoulders, stepped out. He turned ahead, big and shaggy as a buffalo, in the direction of Maida's little shop. The piercing eyes, fierce and keen as an eagle's, seemed to penetrate its very walls. This was Jerome Westabrook, whom the world called Buffalo Westabrook. Maida dashed out of the yard, the children trailing her. "Oh, Father, Father, I've told them. I couldn't keep it any longer after I heard the horn." Chapter 3: The Journey. As the train drew into the Scituate station, it seemed to spill children from every door. Counting them carefully, Granny Flynn and Mrs. Dorr found to their great relief that the 12 with whom they started were still all with them. But, big and little, they were all so full of excitement of the trip that it looked as though at any moment they might vanish in the strange country which surrounded them. Arthur, leading the 2 boys, started an investigation of the station. The 3 big girls followed. Only the little children, tired by the trip and awed to quiet by the unfamiliar surroundings, stayed close to the women's skirts. Timmy's big, full eyes surveyed in wonder the strange new world. Delia, who had fallen comfortably asleep in her mother's arms, suddenly waked up, rubbing her eyes, and looked about her. "Oh, take me back," she wailed, in a sudden attack of homesickness, and fortunately fell asleep again. "Oh, here's the car," Maida called. A big, comfortable limousine came round the bend of the road. The driver alighted and came forward. "Here I am at last, Miss Maida," he said, his hand to his cap. "Oh, good afternoon, Bodkins," Maida greeted him. She introduced him to Granny Flynn and Mrs. Dorr, then to the children. "I'm sorry I was late, ma'am," Bodkins said to Granny Flynn, "but I nearly ran over a dog in the road. I stopped to see if it was all right." "And was it?" Rosie Brine, who had a passion for animals, asked eagerly. Right as a trivet, Botkins answered. What is a trivet, Maida? Rosie asked in a mystified aside. I'll show you in a few minutes, Goose, Maida rejoined. It's an English word. Botkins, who was English also, began stowing the party away in the automobile. Granny Flynn and Mrs. Dorr on the back seats, Betsy and Delia between them, and Molly and Timmy at their feet. Maida and Laura, each holding a very active Clark twin, occupied the little seats. Rosie, to her great delight, was permitted to sit with the driver. The three boys hung on to the running board. We look like an orphan asylum, Arthur commented, and, with a long call of warning from the horn, they started off. The road stretched straight before them, wide and yellow, furred with trees on both sides, then vanished under an arch of green as it turned to the left. Aren't there any houses in Scituate, Maida? Laura asked. Plenty, Maida answered. We'll come to some in a minute, then to more. In a little while, we'll go right through the town. For a few moments, nobody spoke, just watched for the first house. Presently, a little white farmhouse, gambrel-roofed and old, popped into view at one side. Oh, did you see that lovely old well with the long pole? Rosie exclaimed from the front seat. That's a well sweep, Maida explained. It has a bucket at one end. Oh, see the ponies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But the car shot Laura past before she had all the ponies counted. Gee, look at all those hens, came from Arthur. Must be 100. And then followed a chorus of "Oh, sees!" The beautiful big barn with its wide doors, the lovely little pond covered with lily pads, the trim little vine-covered summer house perched on the hill, beehives, the old graveyard, and "See the moo cow?" piped up Betsy Hale, and "Tea de moo tow?" Delia, as usually, mimicked her. Timmy did not speak, but his big eyes, made bigger by wonder, mirrored everything. There's the town, Maida said finally, and again for a few moments there was silence. The town manifested itself as first only by scattered farmhouses, but these began to draw closer and closer together until, finally, they seemed almost to huddle about the beautiful little white church, standing amidst rows of old lichen-covered slate gravestones, and pointing with a slender, delicately cut and carved, white spire at the blue sky. Stores were here too, a moving picture house, a small inn, a post office, a garage. Then the road turned suddenly, and for an instant it was almost as though their speed would take them across the broad stretch of a velvety green lawn into the blue harbor which expanded beyond. This harbor bore here and there white-sailed boats. Not far away, a boy was fishing from the side of a dory. There was a chorus of delighted ohs and ahs from the car, but their speed did not abate for a moment. On they went and soon the village was behind, far behind. Houses were drawing apart from each other. The forest was closing about the farms, separating them. Now the car was on the smooth, hard road again, thick tree growths on both sides. With a contented sigh, Betsy closed her eyes and fell fast asleep. Delia had long ago surrendered to the Sandman. Molly was trying her best to keep awake, but it was obvious that she could not hold out long. Timmy's eyes were beginning to film with fatigue, but he fought it manfully. Even the Clark twins had become silent, but the other children were as wide awake as when they started. More yellow road and more yellow road, more green trees and more green trees. In the front seat, Rosie bounced. "Oh, Maida," she called, "it seems to me I can't wait. Will we ever get there?" Maida's eyes danced. "Oh, in an hour or so," she said airily. "An hour?" Laura groaned. "We've gone 1,000 miles already." Even as she spoke, the motor turned smoothly, the horn emitting a long silvery gurgle. They entered, between two massive stone posts, a long avenue which curved away in the distance like a wide gray tape thrown amidst the trees. "Maida Westabrook, you fibber!" Rosie exclaimed. "We're here now." Maida only twinkled. On they went. On both sides grew great trees, but unlike the forests that stretched away from the public roads which they had just traversed, these roads had been freed of their underbrush. The grass beneath them was like velvet, and lying on it, as though liquid gold had oozed or poured through the branches, shone tiny splashes and great pools of sunlight. It looked as though the whole green earth were caught in a golden net. On and on. To the impatient children, it seemed that they went miles. "Oh!" Arthur Duncan exclaimed suddenly, and then, "Oh! Oh!" The car had turned so that it looked straight down into a cleared glade. At the end of the vista, a group of deer, dappled in white all over their lovely brown bodies, lifted their heads, and with their great soft eyes surveyed the car. But they stared for such a tiny fraction of a second that it scarcely seemed that the thing had happened at all, for in a flash there was a glimpse of white as they turned tail. They vanished as instantly, as completely, as miraculously as though they were ghosts. "Oh, Maida!" Rosie exclaimed. "Dear! How wonderful! Do they belong to your father, or are they wild?" "Those that you saw are dappled, dear. Father had them brought here from England," Maida answered. "But once in a while we do see wild deer in this country." "Oh, I'd like to see some wild deer," Arthur said. Dickie didn't speak, but his eyes were luminous. As for Harold, he was still gasping with the surprise of it. On they went. The road curved and rippled like a ribbon being constantly thrown ahead of them. Suddenly, they came to a great cleared space, smoother than any plush. Botkin stopped the car. At the end towered a huge house of white marble with terraces. On the lawn, which stretched between the children and the house, grew wide separated a few stately trees. Wineglass elms, oaks, copper beeches, and powdered spruces. It was very still now, and unimpeded. The setting sun was sending great golden shafts across the stretch of plushy grass. They struck a pool of water in a marble basin in the middle of that emerald velvet, and through the fountain which played about it, here, there, yonder, motionless in that liquid golden light, were white objects. "What are those white things?" Dickie asked curiously. And then one of the white objects arose, opened like a fan, spread to a wonderful size its snow-white tail, moved in stately fashion along the velvety green lawn. "Maida!" Dickie gasped. "Not—" "Yes, they are. White peacocks." Yes, Maida answered. White peacocks. I'm so glad they were there. Everything has happened just as I wanted it. Sometimes it will be days before you see deer, although there are so many here. And sometimes the peacocks wander to the back of the house. I knew you wanted to see them, Dickie, and I've been hoping all along that they would be here for you. There are 7. We have a dozen. Dickie was listening with all his ears, but at the same time he was looking with all his eyes. For out of the trees to the left suddenly appeared another pair of peacocks in full sail. Not white ones this time, great prismatic blue and green creatures. The sun struck bronze lights out of them as they floated on. It's like a fairy tale, Dickie breathed. Are we going to live here? Rosie asked in an odd tone. Oh, mercy, no, Maida answered. That's Father's house, the big house. Our house is ever so much nicer. I hope it isn't any bigger, Laura said, her voice a little odd, too. Maida laughed a little. No, it's not quite as big as that, she admitted. Shall I go on, Miss Maida? Botkins asked. Yes, please, Botkins, Maida answered. And they continued to go on through more winding, geometrically perfect, beautifully kept gray roads. Past armies and armies of trees, high, plumy-tipped, feathery-trunked aristocratic elms, vigorous, irregular-shaped, peasant-like oaks, clumps, gracefully slender, fluttering a veil of green leaves of white birch, occasional pine, resinous and shining, beeches, firs. Suddenly, everybody exclaimed at once, "Oh, see the pond!" What pond is it? Harold asked. It's called by some people Spy Pond, Maida answered, but I call it the Magic Mirror. It's our pond, and I think I ought to be allowed to call it what I want. I think so too, agreed Laura. What do you mean by our pond? Arthur asked. Just what I say, Maida replied promptly. It's our pond. It belongs to my father, and it's part of the grounds of Maida's little house. We can go swimming in it every day. That is, if we don't prefer. She broke off in a little embarrassed laugh. Oh, Maida, you are so full of secrets I could kill you, Rosie threatened. Maida only laughed. They passed the pond, which stretched for a considerable distance, long and crescent-shaped between its tree-hung banks, and now they were in the real forest. The road was smooth as always and beautifully kept, but on both sides the forest had been left to grow as it pleased. It was filled with underbrush. The tree trunks were obscured by great bushes. Here and there through openings, the children could see gigantic rocks thrusting great heads and shoulders out of the masses of rusty-colored leaves. Oh, isn't it lovely, Rosie said in a perfect ecstasy. Lovely, 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 she went on repeating dreamily, as though caught in a trance of delight. She ended with a scream. Did you see that? What was it, Maida? A woodchuck, Maida answered smilingly. Timmy, awakened by Rosie's scream, asked if there were any lions and tigers about. Much disappointed at Maida's no, he fell asleep again. And now they seemed to be going uphill, slowly but steadily up, 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 up. The car had begun to speed a little. Ahead was another rounding curve. Botkins took it with a flash. The car came out in front of... It was one of the little colonial farmhouses, a story and a half in height, weather-colored, slant-roofed, to which addition after addition has been added by succeeding generations. It was set in an expanse of lawn cut cleanly in two by a path of irregularly shaped, sunken stones, dominated, one on either side, by twin elms of enormous girth and amplitude. The house faced the east. The additions, which now merged into one long structure, had gone off to the right and the north where they joined a big barn. This barn was the same velvety, gray-weathered color as the house, but with great doors painted a strange deep old blue, which had faded to an even stranger deeper blue. The sun struck into the open door and shot over the shining sides of a half a dozen brilliantly covered canoes lying face downwards on the floor, glittered in the bright work of a half a dozen bicycles drawn up in a line. The front door of the house opened, and a colored man and woman, young and smiling, came out to meet them. The automobile seemed to explode children, who started over the lawn of the house. What a house it was! The pointed-topped, pillared vestibule entrance was covered with roses, which smothered it in a pink bloom. Hollyhocks, not blooming yet, marched in files along the front of the house. Lilacs in heavy blossom bunched in hedges at the ends. At one side, a trumpet vine, with a trunk as thick as iron cable, had crept to the very top spine of the house, was crawling towards the single ample chimney which protruded from the middle of the roof. At the other side, a graceful elm thrust close to the shingles. A syringa bush and a smoke bush grew in front, but charming as was the house, interesting as was the barn, the children's eyes did not linger long on either of them, because inevitably their gaze fixed on the annex which made an intermediate house between them. For in the middle of it, yes, in it and through it, grew an enormous gnarled oak. Its trunk emerged from the roof, and its long level branches spread over it in every direction. More than that, above that roof, securely caught in those flatly growing, widely spread branches, was a little tree house. The colored pair were almost on them now. "Good afternoon, Florabelle," Maida greeted them. "Good afternoon, Zeke. Let me introduce you to Mrs. Flynn and Mrs. Dorr." Then she turned to the rest of the group. "Children," she commanded in a tone of happy pride, "behold Maida's little house." Chapter 4. The Little House. "Do you want to see the place now, or wait until after supper?" Maida asked, after the last admiring exclamation had died. The last pair of cramped legs had stretched themselves out. "I am starved," Rosie answered instantly, "but I must see everything first." The others echoed Rosie's decision with a fury of enthusiasm. "We can't see the back of the house from here," Arthur said, as though that clinched the matter. And so, while Granny Flynn and Mrs. Dorr, the little children tagging them in a daze of fatigue shot with excitement, were being taken care of by Florabelle and Zeke, Maida led the older children on a voyage of exploration. "Now first," she said in a practical voice, "let's go off a little distance, so that I can show you the whole lay of the land." The 6 of them returned almost to the spot where they had first caught sight of the little house. "I'm going to start by telling you a little of the history of the house," Maida began importantly. "This is the old Westabrook farmhouse, and my father was born here, and his father and his father. It was built in 1645, and Westabrooks have lived in it from that day to this. "Oh, Maida," Rosie said in an awed tone. "Isn't that wonderful? Is it just the same as it was then?" "No, indeed," Maida answered. "Almost every generation of Westabrooks added something to the original house. The barn was built later, and also all those little additions. We call them the annex, which connect the house with the barn. But it was my father who made the sides of them all windows." "Who put the little house in the tree?" Dickie asked. "My grandfather." "Wasn't it wonderful that they left the tree?" Laura commented. "Yes. You see, my grandmother loved that big old tree dearly, and so they saved it for her. Now, where shall we go first?" "Up the tree," everybody answered. "All right. I might have known you would have said that," Maida declared, "when I'm just dying to show you the house." The tree grew out of the middle of the annex. The floor had been fitted neatly about the tree trunk. Stairs led up to the roof, and from the roof a short flight of steps led to the tree house. One after another the children mounted them. It took them into a little square room with windows looking in all 4 directions. "Oh, I can see Spy Pond. I mean the magic mirror," Rosie exclaimed. "And from here you can see the big house," Laura exclaimed. "Not very much, just a sort of shining." "Oh, but look, see," Dickie stuttered in his excitement. "From here you can see the ocean." The children deserted the other windows and rushed to Dickie's side. In the west appeared all a-sparkle, what looked like a great heaving mass of melted glass. On and on it stretched and on, until it cut through the vapory sky and disappeared forever. A few sailboats, like great gulls, were beating their wings on its glittering surface. "Isn't it wonderful?" Rosie said in a solemn voice. "It makes me feel almost like not speaking." "Wait until you see it in a nor'easter," Maida promised, "or a great thunderstorm." "Just think," Arthur said, "all my life I've wanted to learn to sail a boat." "You will sometime," Maida interrupted. "But Father says we've all got to learn to swim before we can get into a sailboat." "I know how to swim," Arthur stated in an offhand voice. "All boys do." "I don't," Dickie said. "Well, you will in a week," Maida promised. Harold had all this time been keenly examining the ocean, the curving line of shore. "What's that island off there, Maida?" he asked. "Everybody calls it Spectacles Island because it's shaped like a pair of spectacles. But I call it Tom Tiddler's Ground because nobody lives there. I don't see why I shouldn't call it what I want. It's my island." "Your island?" Rosie repeated. "Oh, Maida, you lucky girl." Maida flushed and looked ashamed. "I mean our island," she corrected herself. "Well," Rosie said in a meditative tone, "with a farmhouse in the country, the ocean with an island in it in front of it, a forest with deer in back of it, and a pond. Maida, can you think of anything else that we could possibly have?" "Well, there might be a volcano on the island," Maida suggested. "A grotto, somewhere like the Blue Grotto of Capri. And then, of course, we have no glaciers, geysers, hot springs, deserts, or bogs." "Oh, you goose," Rosie interrupted. "You know we couldn't have any of those things." "We might have a cave," Arthur said. "Are there any caves around here, Maida?" "Not that I know of," Maida answered. "Now let me show you the rest of the place. You've been so busy looking at the ocean that you haven't noticed there's a tennis court and a croquet ground just below." The 5 excited faces peered out of the open window, down through the tree branches, and there was, indeed, a great cleared velvety lawn with wickets and stakes at one end, and a tennis court marked in white calcimine at the other. "Now," Maida said, "come into the house. Oh, I forgot to tell you that I call this tree Father Time because it's the oldest one on the place. It's too bad that I named all these things years ago, because you could have had the fun of naming them too." "But I like your names, Maida," Dickie declared. Climbing down the narrow stairs, Maida conducted them through the 2 rooms of the annex, which lay between the tree room and the little house. The tiny procession marched first into the kitchen, which was the second of these rooms, a big sunny room. The walls painted a deep blue, and hanging against them great pans and platters of brass and copper. From the kitchen, they entered the dining room, a big room also, which ran the entire width of the house, all doors and windows on the western side. A long, wide table in the center, chairs along the walls, and a pair of mahogany sideboards facing each other from the ends. These were its furnishings. They passed through a door on the eastern wall. "Now," Maida said, "we're in the original house. This used to be the old kitchen. Now it's the living room. Look at the great fireplace with the oven at one side. This big wooden shovel was used to put the pans of bread in and take them out. See how sweet all the old paneling is? That's been here from the beginning, and all the H hinges and the old butterfly hinges, and these darling little closets, and those big old beams with the spatter work on them. Father had this great fender built around the fireplace so that the little children couldn't fall into it when there's a fire." "Are we going to have fires in that enormous place?" Rosie asked. "I wish the temperature would fall to below 0, Laura declared recklessly. "I should think it would take 4-foot logs." Arthur had been examining the fireplace. Crouching down, he had even walked into it, stared up into the chimney. "It does," Maida informed him proudly. "Oh, there, Rosie," she pointed to a little triangular brass object on the hearth, "is a trivet." Rosie pounced on it. "It looks like a brass cricket. What's it for?" "To put the teapot on, close to the fire so it will keep hot." Out of the living room through the northern door, they came into one of the 2 smaller front rooms. The walls were lined with books, and here was a big table with a reading lamp, a desk, a few comfortable chairs. "This is the library," Maida announced proudly. "I'd like to shut myself up here for a month," Dickie, who was a great reader, said wistfully. "It looks as if all the books were interesting." "Oh, they are," Maida assured him. "The Lang fairy books, and Grimm and Anderson, George MacDonald and Louisa May Alcott, and Howard Pyle and Stevenson and Kipling, and all the nicest books that Father and Billy Potter and Dr. Pierce and I could think of, and lots more that they selected that I never heard of." From the library, they went outdoors, through the little vine-covered vestibule. From upstairs came the voice of Granny Flynn and Mrs. Dorr, putting the younger children to bed. "We 3 girls," Maida explained, "have rooms at the front of the house on the 2nd floor. The nursery is back over the dining room." "Where do we sleep?" Harold asked. "You boys," Maida replied, "are going to sleep in the barn." "Gee Willikins!" Dickie exclaimed. "What fun that'll be!" I'd rather sleep in a barn than any place I know, Arthur said. It's pretty good fun sleeping in a tent, Harold threw in. I was going to say, Arthur went on, except out of doors in the woods. Now, which shall I show you first? Maida asked. The boys' room or the girls' room? She did not wait for an answer. Come on, girls, she continued in a tone of resignation. We've got to show the boys their place first. They won't look at anything until they've seen them. The procession moved toward the barn. The lower floor, roomy, raftered, sweet-smelling, was empty except for the canoes, a small runabout, the bicycles, a phonograph, a big chest, garden tools. Maida led the way to the second floor. The railed stairway ran close to the side of the barn, brought them through a square opening in the ceiling into another big room, the second story. Here, in each of 3 corners, were army cots. Beside each cot, a tall chiffonier. On top of each chiffonier were toilet articles in a simple style. Beside each chiffonier, a chair. That's your bathroom over there. Maida pointed to the 4th corner, which was partitioned off. It has a shower. I don't expect you'll use it much, because we'll be bathing every day in the magic mirror. You hang your clothes on hooks behind these curtains. You see, you each have a closet of your own. The boys were, of course, opening chiffonier drawers, pulling aside curtain-draped closets, examining the shower. Their curiosity appeased, they made for downstairs and the canoes. Now, while you boys are examining the barn, would you girls like to explore upstairs in the house? Maida asked. I'm just dying to see my own room, Laura declared firmly. The 2 girls pelted across the lawn in the wake of Maida's eager footsteps. They ran up the tiny steep flight of stairs exactly opposite the little vestibule entrance. It brought them into a small hall from which opened 4 small slant-roofed chambers. This is my room, Maida said, pointing to one of the south chambers, the back room on the right of the stairs. I have always slept there when we have been in the house. I love it because of the great tree outside my window. I have always called this tree Mother Nature to go with Father Time. So you see, I have a father tree and a mother tree. When there's a storm, the boughs make such a sweet sound rubbing against my walls, and often little twigs tap on my window, and sometimes it sounds exactly as though the leaves were whispering to me. Oh, Maida, Rosie exclaimed. I never saw anything so lovely in all my life. How I love that bed and that sweet little cricket. The room was simple. It held but a big double old-fashioned canopied bed, an old-fashioned maple bureau, and an old-fashioned maple desk, a little straight slat-backed chair in front of the desk, and a little slat-backed rocker by one of the windows, but it was quaint. In front of the rocker was a cricket, as though just ready for little feet. The flowered wallpaper matched the chintz curtains and the chintz ruffles on the little cricket. Under the window, in a little old-fashioned child chair, sat a great rag doll, and beside her was a little haircloth trunk. Yes, it is perfectly lovely, Laura agreed. But oh, Maida, do show me my room. What a selfish goop I am, Maida exclaimed in contrition. Your room, Rosie, is in front of mine, and Laura's across the hall. The 3 little girls tumbled pell-mell into the front room. It did not differ much from Maida's or Laura's across the way, except where the keynote of Maida's wallpaper and chintzes were yellow. That of Rosie's was crimson and Laura's blue. In each there was a double canopied bed, a little old-fashioned bureau, a little old-fashioned cricket, 2 quaint little old-fashioned chairs. But all these things differed in detail, and although the rooms showed a similarity, they all showed an individuality. Rosie and Laura went wild with excitement. "Oh, look at my sweet, sweet closet," Laura called from her room. "What a strange shape with the roof slanting like that, and a baby window in it." "And the windows," Rosie took it up from her room. 4, 8, 12, 16, 24 panes, and such strange glass, all full of bubbles and crinkles and wiggle-waggles. And the beaming Maida ran frantically from the one room to the other, and from the other to the one, was saying, "Yes, aren't they lovely little closets? Running under the eaves like that? I'm so glad you like them. I was afraid you would think they were strange. Yes, that's old glass. All of the window glass in the house is old, and some of it is such a lovely color." After a while, the frantic shutting and opening of desk drawers, bureau drawers, and closet drawers ceased. The ohs and ahs died down from the lack of breath. Maida led the way into the south room at the left. "This is the guest chamber. And now," she added, heading the file through a door at the back of the small hall which led into a big long room, "we're out of the main house and in the annex. This is the nursery. It is over the dining room." The nursery was a big room with a little bed in each corner, miniature tables, and chiffoniers all painted white. "Molly, Timmy, Dorothy, Mabel," Maida pointed to the 4 beds. "Delia will sleep in that room at the left with her mother, and Betsy in this room at the right with Granny Flynn. You see, both these rooms open into the nursery, and Granny and Mrs. Dora can keep an eye on what's going on here." "They'll have to keep 2 eyes on it if Betsy's here," Rosie prophesied. "Now, except for the laundry and some empty rooms in the annex, I think you've seen everything. Everything, that is, except Floribelle's and Zeke's room. I don't suppose you want to see them. And besides, I'd have to ask their permission." "If I see another thing this day," Rosie declared desperately, "I shall die of happiness this minute." Fortunately, however, she was not called upon to gaze on any object which would have resulted in so speedy a demise, for just at that moment the cowbell rang. "That's supper," Maida explained. Reinforcing the cowbell's call came Mrs. Dora's voice. "You must come down now, children. Your supper's on the table, all nice and hot." Chapter 5. Morning. The sun poured through the windows on Maida's bed. She stirred. Was it a bird calling her? No, it was the phonogram. She peeped out the window. Arthur had brought the phonogram to the opening of the barn door. It was playing Bugle Calls of the American Army. It was Rivali that she was listening to. The door to her bedchamber flew open, and Rosie, her heavy curls flying, her black eyes sparkling, precipitated herself across the room. "Oh, Maida," she exclaimed, "isn't it wonderful? I am not dreaming, am I? Ow!" as Maida pinched her. "I've been awake for I don't know how long, listening to the birds and everything. I have been waiting ever so long for you to wake up. I thought you would never stir." "Well, now that I am awake, I'll dress as soon as possible," Maida promised. "We've got a long day before us. Let's go in and get Laura up." Laura was still in a deep slumber. Indeed, she showed a marked disinclination to awaken. Rosie charitably assisted her efforts by the application to her face of a very wet and very cold sponge. For some reason, this action precipitated a pillow fight. In the midst of it, the breakfast bell sounded, but they paid no attention to it. Finally, Granny Flynn had to call, "Stop that running about, children, and get dressed. Breakfast will be on the table in a minute." When the second bell rang, the boys came in from the barn and the 12 children. Granny Flynn at one end of the table and Mrs. Dorr at the other sat down to a breakfast of fruit, oatmeal, eggs, and all the milk they wanted. After breakfast, Maida said, "Now, first I want to show the 6 little children where is the nicest place for them to play. Do the rest of you want to come?" The rest did want to come. Perhaps Laura voiced their sentiments when she said, "That's a great idea, Maida. Get the little children interested so they won't be forever tagging us." Maida led the way to the side of the house, the north. They crossed an expanse of a lawn, came to an opening in the stone wall. Beyond looked like unbroken forest, but from the break in the wall, threading its way through the trees, appeared a well-worn path. They followed it for a few rods. It ended flush against a big sloping rock. "This," Maida said triumphantly, "is House Rock." The children swarmed over it. "Isn't it a beauty?" Rosie exclaimed. It was a beauty, and especially for play purposes. It was big, cut up by stratification into all levels, but low. At its highest end, it was not 3 feet from the ground. Trees shaded it, bushes hedged it, mosses padded it. No wonder it had been named House Rock, for it was a perfect setting for those housekeeping games in which little children so delight. "Now, listen to me, little 6, Maida began, but Arthur interrupted. "Why, that's a great name for them, the little 6. And we," he added triumphantly, "are the big 6. "Molly and Mabel and Dorothy and Betsy and Delia and Timmy," Maida started again, "all of you listen. You are the little 6. This is your playground. There are some toys in the house, dolls and dolls' dishes and dolls' furniture, which you can bring here to play house with. But you are not to go far from the rock, and when you hear the cowbell, you must always return to the little house." "Is that all?" Laura asked eagerly. "And now can we leave the little 6 and go exploring?" The little 6 waited, dancing with excitement, impatient for the first time in their lives to have the big children go. "Not yet," Maida responded. "Just one more thing for the little 6. She led the way around House Rock to its high end. From there, another well-worn path started off. The children followed her down its curving way. Not far from House Rock, it came into a big circular enclosure, grassy and surrounded by trees. "What's this, Maida?" Arthur asked. "It's a fairy ring," Maida answered solemnly. "A fairy ring," Dickie repeated in an odd tone. "Is it really a fairy ring?" "That's what I've always called it," Maida replied. "I don't know what it is if it isn't a fairy ring. I have never seen anything like it, except in England, and there they always call them fairy rings, and besides, nobody knows what it's used for." Arthur strolled around the entire circumference of the ring, keenly examining the ground and the surrounding trees. "It looks like a wood clearing to me," he said in a low tone to Maida when he rejoined the group. Betsy, silenced for the first time in her 5 years of experience, suddenly exploded. "Oh, goody, goody, goody!" she exclaimed. "Now the fairies will come and play with us." I've always wanted to see a fairy. Now I'm going to see one." "I don't believe there's any such things as fairies," Timmy declared sturdily. "Oh, Timmy," Dorothy Clark remonstrated, "I should think you'd be ashamed of yourself. Of course there's fairies." "Well, anyway," Timmy still sturdily stood his ground, "if they are, I don't believe they'll come and play with us." "Well, I believe they will," Mabel Clark reinforced her sister. But Betsy was capering up and down the length and breadth of the fairy ring. "I know the fairies will come," she sang aloud. "I know the fairies will come. I know the fairies will come." When the older children left the fairy ring, all 6 of the little children were capering too. The last thing they heard was Delia's mimicking words. "I know the fairies tum. I know the fairies tum." "That's over," Maida said. "I told Granny Flynn," she explained, "that I'd show the little children a nice place to play. Now let's go into the living room and talk. There are a whole lot of things I've got to tell you that I haven't had time to tell you yet." Although it was a June day, and as warm and sunny as June knows how to be, they gathered about the big fireplace, where already logs were piled and ready to burn. The boys sat on the fender, the girls drew up chairs. After they were all comfortable, Maida began. "Father says that this first week we can all rest. It's to be our vacation. But after that, we've got to work. Father says that there are some things that every girl ought to know how to do, and some things every boy ought to know. And we're going to learn those things living in the little house." Rosie's eyes danced. "Hurry," she urged Maida. Maida drew a long breath. "There's so much of it. You see, there's a good deal of work about the house, although it seems small. Florabelle, she's the maid, is going to do the cooking, and Zeke, her husband, will attend to most of the outside work. Of course, Granny Flynn and Mrs. Dorr will run everything, but we girls are to take care of our own rooms and the flower garden." "Oh, goody, goody!" Rosie exclaimed. "I love flowers." "We are to keep the house decorated with flowers, and once every week we are to do the housekeeping for the entire day. That's Florabelle's and Zeke's day off. That day we have to plan the meals, do the marketing, cook the food, wash and wipe the dishes." "Gee, I'm glad I'm not a girl," Harold said jubilantly. "Oh, your turn comes now," Maida declared. "You boys have got to weed and water the vegetable garden, gather vegetables whenever they are needed, run errands, take care of the tennis court." "For my part," Laura declared, "I wish we did all the cooking. I love it." "You wouldn't love it if you did it for 16 people," Maida commented in a scandalized tone. "It's just as though we were all alone by ourselves," Rosie declared jubilantly. "We are," Maida stated. "We're 3 miles from the big house. We shan't see any of Father's company. Father has closed one of the roads that leads to the little house, and the other is a secret one that nobody but he and Botkins and I know. Your parents are invited to visit you whenever they wish. Of course, Father will come to see us occasionally, and let me tell you, he will come when we least expect it. And if anything isn't an apple pie order. Of course, there's the telephone if we should need help or anything happened, but otherwise, we're almost all alone in the world." "It's like a storybook," Dickie commented. "Maida," Rosie said, "you speak of a flower garden and a vegetable garden, but I don't remember that you showed them to us last night." No, I didn't, Maida explained. We were all getting so tired, but I'll show them to you now. Come. She led the way through the living room, through the dining room to the back door of the house. Then she turned north. This room is the laundry, she said. And here, pointing to an enclosure set off by a high vine-grown lattice, is the drying yard. They were now walking on a path which ran between the house and a file of cypresses, standing trim and tall, and so close that they made a hedge. Maida led the way to the corner where there was an opening. There, a great rectangle surrounded by cypresses, was a garden, all roses. The bushes were already in rich bloom, great creamy white ones and great pinky white ones. Others were deep pink, golden yellow, and a rich dark crimson. This is the rose garden, Maida explained. Beyond, she led the way into still another cypress-guarded square, is the old-fashioned garden. There are nasturtiums here, and phlox, and pansies, and peonies, and lots of other things I can't remember. And in the fall, there'll be dahlias and asters. Rosie shook herself with joy. I shall love working in this garden, she declared. This afternoon, let's fill all the vases in the house with roses. All right, Maida agreed absently. Now I'm going to show you the vegetable garden. I know where that is, Arthur boasted. I got up early and explored. Maida led the way past the croquet ground, past the tennis court to another cypress-bordered square. Here, in parallel lines, were rows of green sprouts. The earth must have turned over in the spring. Indeed, it might have been turned over in the previous fall. Rich loam and cultivator added, it looked like freshly grated chocolate. Gracious, I think I could make fudge of that earth, Rosie exclaimed. How tidy it looks, Laura commented. Yes, Maida agreed. That's because the gardener has put it in perfect condition for you boys. But after this, you've got to take care of it yourselves. And weeds grow like, she paused for a comparison. Like 60, Arthur finished it for her. I know, I've weeded my aunt's garden in Maine. Believe me, it's hot work. The thing to do is to work a little every day. That's the only way you can keep ahead of the weeds. Sure, early in the morning, Dickie remarked. How did you know that, Dickie? Maida asked curiously. I just happened to read it in a book, Dickie explained. Now, when I tell you, Maida went on, as one suddenly remembering the rest of her instructions, that we shall have to go to bed at 9 and get up at 7, I have told you all I have to tell you. Father's very strict about our sleep. He says we must have 10 hours. There's one exception, Saturday night, when we can sit up until 10, and Sunday morning when we can sleep until 8. Now, how would you like to go to the magic mirror? Oh, I've been on pins and needles every moment since we got up wanting to go to that pond, Rosie declared. But then I want to see everything at once. Arthur, do you know how to row a canoe? Dickie asked. No, I don't, Arthur admitted. I do, said Harold, with a slight accent of superiority. But you don't row a canoe, you row a boat, and you paddle a canoe. Does it take long to learn? Dickie asked, with great interest. No, and it's as easy as pie when you get the hang of it. But you fall overboard 100 times before you do that. I can't swim, Dickie said, disconsolately. Never mind, Dickie, Maida comforted him. You'll soon learn. Can you swim, Rosie? Yes, I'll teach you, Dickie. You begin first with water wings, and then... In the meantime, following Maida's lead, they were going north. "Hey," Arthur remonstrated. "The way to the pond, the magic mirror, is over in that direction." "This is another way to it," Maida explained. "Once you've taken it, you'll never take any other." A little path disengaged itself from the trees which fringed the lawn, began to wind away, almost hidden among the trees. The children followed Maida in Indian file. For a few moments, they could hear Granny Flynn calling to the younger children. Then the voices gradually died away. Bird voices took their places. The calm and the hush of the deep forest fell upon them. "Oh, isn't it wonderful?" Rosie said in an odd tone. It makes me feel like, well, it's like being in church." On both sides of the fresh green of the trees made an intricate screen through which the sunlight poured and splashed. The birds kept up their calls, and many insects called too. A bee buzzed through a tiny interval of silence. Then a crow cawed. The road turned, dipped, sank. "Isn't it pretty?" Maida exclaimed as they descended into a hollow with high, thick, blossoming wild rose bushes on both sides. Involuntarily, the big six stopped and looked about them. They stood in a little dimple in the earth, bushes growing thick and high on its sides. "How hot it is down here," Laura commented, "and how sweet it smells." "I call it the bosky dingle," Maida explained. "What does bosky dingle mean?" Dickie inquired. "It's a poetry phrase," Maida told him. "It means a kind of woody hollow." "There's the pond," called the practical Harold. The children broke into a run. They came out on a cleared space with a boathouse and a long jetty leading from a newly shingled shed into the water. "This is for the canoes," Maida explained. She unlocked the door and showed a single wide empty room. "Oh, let's go home and get the canoes and bring them down here," Arthur explained. "I'm wild to try them." "It will take 2 to carry each canoe," Harold explained, "and we need bathing suits." "There are bathing suits at home for all of us," Maida explained. "Shall we turn back?" She asked this question politely, but she said it a little reluctantly. Rosie seemed to see her reluctance. "Did you have another plan, Maida?" Rosie demanded. "Well, you see," Maida answered slowly, "there's a gypsy camp halfway round the magic mirror, and I thought you might like to visit it." Chapter 6. Afternoon. "A gypsy camp?" Arthur repeated. "Sure, I'd love to go." "Gypsies." Laura shrank a little. "I think I'd be scared of gypsies." "You wouldn't be scared of these gypsies," Maida promised. "I've known them ever since I was a little girl. I'm very fond of them." "Well, let's go," Arthur said, shifting from one foot to another in impatient excitement. The procession started again. "Tell us more about the gypsies, Maida," Arthur demanded at once. "There isn't very much to tell, except that they've come here every summer ever since I can remember, and, indeed, long before I was born. Father has always permitted them to camp on this ground rent-free. I don't seem to remember much about them when I was very little, except that I used to go and buy baskets with Granny Flynn, and they always told Granny's fortune. Cross my palm with silver, they say. That means put some money in my hand." "How many are there?" Dickie inquired. "Not many, perhaps a dozen. Let me see. There's Aunt Save and Uncle Save, the father and mother, and Aunt Vashti, the old, old grandmother. She would frighten even you, Rosie. She looks like a witch. But she's very kind and I'm very fond of her. And there's Esther and Miriam, their daughters, and Hector and Tom, their husbands, and their children. And then there are always 3 or 4 relatives, different ones every year, who come up from the south with them." "They go south then every winter?" Arthur continued. "Yes," Maida answered. She continued to give them her memories of the gypsies through the rest of the long, shaded, greenly winding walk, and the children asked many questions. Presently, the trail expanded ahead into a clearing. "There they are," Arthur called. The clearing was surrounded by pines. Against this background, a group of tents pointed their weather-stained pyramids up from the brown pine needles. In the middle, a fire was burning. A black pot, hanging from a triangle of stout sticks, emitted a cloud of steam and a busy bubbling. A wagon stood off among the trees, and tethered by a long rope, 2 horses were feeding. A trio of hounds, 2 old and 1 young, rose as the children approached, made slowly in their direction. An old woman, so wrinkled that her face looked as though it could never have been smooth, with great hoops of gold in her ears, a red kerchief on her head, and a black one around her neck, stood watching the pot. A little distance off, a younger woman, buxom and brown, mended. 3 men, 1 middle-aged, 2 younger, sat smoking. "Those dogs won't bite us, Maida," Laura said in a panic, "will they?" "Oh no," Maida said. "They know me." "Hi, Lise, hi, Teague," she called. The hounds burst into a run, came bounding to her side, leaped up and licked her face. Maida staggered under the onslaught, but Arthur expertly seized their collars, held them. The excitement in the gypsy camp was immediate. "It's Maida," ran a murmur from mouth to mouth. The young woman leaped to her feet. The old woman, less alert, but still nimble, sprang from the grass also. They all, even the men, came forward, smiling eagerly. Maida shook hands with them and introduced her friends. "When did you get here?" Maida asked. "I've had Zeke come down here every day for a week looking for you. Every day until yesterday, when in the excitement of our arrival, he neglected to come." "We came yesterday," they explained. They were most of them dark, with longish hair and flashing dark eyes, but their look was very friendly. They asked Maida a multitude of questions about her father and Granny Flynn, her trip abroad. Finally, Maida asked them if they had any baskets ready for sale. "A few," Mrs. Savory said, looking pleased. "Oh, Silva, bring the baskets out. Maida, you've never seen Silva and Timma, have you? They're my sister's children. My sister died last summer, and now they're living with us." A voice answered. In a moment, it was a child's voice, and yet it had a curious grown-up accent, as of an unusual decision of character. The doors of one of the tents parted, and a girl's head appeared in the opening. The children stared at her. For an instant, nobody spoke. The head disappeared. When the girl emerged, her hands were full of baskets. Behind her came a lad, very like her, but older. Silva Burl was a slender brown girl. She did not look any older than Rosie, but she was much taller, and she was as tawny as Rosie was dark. Her hair, a strange amber color, hung straight to her shoulders, where the ends turned upwards, not in a curl, but in a big soft wave. Her eyes were not big, but they were long. They were like bits of shining amber set under her thin, straight brows. Her skin was a tanned amber too. She wore a much-patched, rusty dark skirt with a white midi blouse and a tattered yellow ribbon tie. Timma, her brother, was slim too, but strong-looking, active. He had a dark skin and hair so black that there was a purple steeliness about it. In all this swarthy coloring, his eyes, a clear blue, seemed strange and unexpected. His brows were thick, and they lowered as the eyes under them contemplated the group of children. Silva's lips curled disdainfully upwards. Silva nodded briefly when her aunt performed the simple introduction. "This is Maida and her friend, Silva," but Timma merely stared. Then turning his back, he strolled away to where the horses were feeding, untethered one of them. With a single leap of his athletic body, he was on its back. In another instant, the green leaves of the forest closed around him as he disappeared, riding bareback into it. "What beautiful baskets you have, Silva," Maida said politely. Silva did not deign to answer. She spread her handiwork out on the table, which stood not far from the fire, and then, leaving her prospective customers to their choice, went over to the fire, sat down before it, her back to the children. Aunt Save seemed to feel dimly that something was wrong. She moved over to the table and began displaying the baskets. Maida made an effort to relieve her embarrassment. "Oh, Aunt Save," she said, "what do you suppose is the first thing I'm going to do when I get time?" Without waiting for an answer, she went swiftly on. "I'm going to wash and iron all Lucy's clothes and pack them nicely away in a little old haircloth trunk which I found in the attic. Lucy," she explained to her friends, "is a great big rag baby doll that Aunt Save made for me when I was little. It's as big as a baby 2 years old. I was fonder of it than any doll I have ever had, and so Granny Flynn made it a whole outfit of clothes, all the things a baby should have. I'm going to pack them away and keep them for my daughter." "Do you mean that rag baby doll that's sitting in the little chair in your room?" Rosie asked. "And that little queer brown trunk under the window where the tree is?" This slant of the conversation seemed to interest Silva, for she turned a little, listened intently to what followed. "Yes, that's Lucy," Maida answered. "All her clothes are in the trunk." "Well, I made that doll for you," Aunt Save said. "I didn't think you'd play with it long. None of us thought you were going to live." "That was before my illness," Maida explained to the other children, "when I was so lame." "I told your father," Aunt Save went on, "that there was only one thing that could save you, and that was to go south and live with us in the piney woods and be a little Romany for a year. But he couldn't seem to let you go for so long." "Oh, Aunt Save," Maida exclaimed, "how I would have loved that. However, it all came out right, because Father gave me a little shop, and I made all these new friends." Chapter 7, Twilight. "I think that Silva Burl was just horrid," Rosie burst out suddenly. "Just horrid," she repeated. I never took such a dislike to a girl in my life. I just simply despise her." The 3 little girls were in the rose garden. It was just after luncheon, and Granny Flynn had said they must do something in the way of quiet exercise before they went to swim in the magic mirror. They had decided to decorate the house with flowers. "She was rather horrid, wasn't she?" Maida agreed absently. So was her brother. "You expect boys to have bad manners," Laura commented scathingly, "but a girl ought to behave herself better than that. She made me so mad I wanted to stick my tongue out at her." "I wanted to box her ears," announced Rosie fiercely. "She seemed to take such a dislike to us, just on sight," Maida went on. "I don't understand it." "We didn't do anything to her. Why, we'd never even seen her before," Rosie interrupted in a crescendo of irritation. "She acted as though," Maida went straight on, "she was afraid of us for some reason, as though she thought we were going to do—" She paused. "Well, I don't know what," she concluded. "I hope we never see the disagreeable thing again," Laura said. "We probably will," Maida declared. "We'll be going to the gypsy camp all the time, but of course she won't come to the little house." "If she does," Rosie threatened, "I'll tell her to go home." Rosie looked cross, and cross she was. Ever since the return from the gypsy camp, her tempestuous brows had not smoothed out their knots. Her eyes alternately burned and flashed, and her cheeks were like red roses on fire. Characteristically, because she wore red whenever she could, Rosie had gathered only the crimson roses. She held a great bunch of them now, and she stood stripping them of their thorns. Laura's roses were pink, Maida's yellow. "I should think this would be enough," Maida suggested in a moment. "Let's put them in vases." "Shall we mix them all together?" Rosie asked. "One color to each room is really prettier. Just think how lovely the living room will be with these great red roses everywhere." "Rosie, you shall decide where the flowers go today, and the next time Laura, and the next time me. That's the only fair way," Maida declared. Indoors, Maida took them to the long closet lined with shelves, lighted by one window and furnished with a small sink, a table, and 3 chairs, which she called the flower closet. On the shelves were vases and bowls of all colors and sizes, some high and slender, some squatty and low, of glass and china. For a few minutes, conversation languished. The 3 little girls were all busy making their selection from these receptacles, cutting away 2 long stems and 2 heavy foliage, removing thorns. Rosie, as usual, her movements were always as swift as lightning, finished her work first. She came into the living room, where Maida and Laura, the result of Laura's idea, were trying bunches of yellow roses in low jars against the bunches of pink ones in high ones. "I wish I could get that Silva Burl out of my mind," Rosie burst out with a sudden return of her irritation. "I keep thinking of her, and I get so mad I'd just like to—" "Granny says we can go down to the pond now," Arthur called suddenly, popping in the door. "We boys have been lugging the 3 canoes down to the magic mirror, and believe me, it's some hot work. Granny says that we must put on our bathing suits here today." Boys and girls raced to their rooms. In a surprisingly brief time, they were back again in bathing suits and bathing shoes, the girls with rubber caps in brilliant colors. "Granny says, as Dickie's the only one that can't swim, we must all promise to look after him," Arthur added warningly on the way to the pond. I can look after myself, Dickie remarked huffily. I'm only telling you what Granny said, Arthur stated. Apparently, Granny had put other responsibilities on him because he went on. I know you swim in deep water, Rosie, because I've seen you, and you too, Harold. But how about you, Laura? Well, I'll show you, Laura promised. You'll have to, Arthur told her, before I'll let you go over your head. He turned to Maida. How about you? I'm not a fast swimmer, nor a strong one, Maida declared, but I am quite accustomed to deep water. I used to go over the side of the yacht with Father every morning in the Mediterranean, and I can swim forever without getting tired out. All right, Arthur said, and then, all in that's going in, he shouted suddenly as the jetty came in sight. He burst into a run, and the file of children raced after him. Over into the water they went in 5 tempestuous dives. Only Dickie remained watching them. They came up almost simultaneously. Arthur and Harold, as a matter of natatorial compliment, threw into each other's faces the mud and weeds they had brought up in their hands. Then they all struck for the middle of the pond. They swam with varying degrees of speed. Arthur first, as became his superior size and strength, his superior skill at all things. Curiously enough, Laura, who cut through the water like a thrown knife, kept a close second to him. The others struggled behind, Maida always in the rear. They turned over and stared into the shining sky. Now tell us a story, Maida, Rosie said. Maida began obediently. Once upon a time, she said to the accompaniment of 5 pairs of hands beating the water, there lived a little girl by the name of Rosie. She was probably the naughtiest little girl in the world. How about Silva Burl? Rosie interrupted quickly. You forget her. I'll tell you what you do forget, Laura took it up. Poor Dickie standing there all alone on the pier. Gee, was all Arthur said, but he turned and swam back, the rest following him. I'm going to give you your first swimming lesson now, Arthur called to the disconsolate figure watching them. Arthur swam inshore. He commanded Dickie to wade into the pond up to his waist. Now, he said, putting one hand under Dickie's chin, drop down slowly until you're lying flat on the water. I'll hold you by the chin and by your bathing suit in the back. Now listen, you're to do exactly what I tell you. You'll think I'm going to drop you, but I cross my throat I won't. But you see that you follow my directions. In a few minutes, Dickie was paddling frantically, his eyes almost bulging out of his head, his lips pursed together, his waving arms and kicking feet beating the water almost to a lather. Breathe the way you always do, Arthur was shouting. You poor fish, open your mouth. Suppose you do swallow some water, it won't hurt you. Haven't you ever drunk any water in your life? Don't kick up and down. Make your legs go the way a frog's does. Don't go so fast. Now I'll count for you. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe, you poor prune. How do you expect you're going to swim without any breath in your body? The others paddled about, adding their jeers or suggestions, but at times they frequently deserted for a longer swim. Laura displayed a number of water tricks. She was as graceful in her swimming as in her dancing, and for a short dash she could go fast. She dove forward, sidewards, and backwards, She sat upright in the water. She turned over and over in a somersault. Her strength was nothing to that of Rosie's, however, who seemed never to tire of any physical exercise. "That will be enough for today, Dickie," Arthur decided finally. "Now put on these water wings and practice the way I've been telling you. Breathe the way you always do and don't go too fast. Don't go into the deep water yet. If the wings should fall off or burst, corrected Rosie promptly. Collapse, Arthur substituted with unexpected elegance. You'll sink like a stone." "I'll stay near the shore," Dickie promised docilely. "You bet," he added. "I don't want to make a hole in the water." Shaking off his pedagogical duties, Arthur set off alone for the middle of the pond, swimming with the long, powerful strokes which characterized him, his head almost under water. "What a stroke he has," Maida commented admiringly. "I'd give anything if I could cut through the water like that." Why, who is that?" Two heads appeared bobbing on the water at the other side of the lake. No one of the children had seen anybody emerge from the woods. The strangers must have come around the curve. The heads came forward straight towards the middle of the lake. Arthur had reached his goal, was floating placidly, his arms folded at the back of his neck. The other children stood silent and watched. Nearer, the two heads came to Arthur, nearer and nearer. One of them had thick tossed black hair, the other lighter hair, satiny as the inside of a nut where the sun caught it on the top of the head, wet and dark as strings of seaweed in the neck. "It's Silva and Timma," Rosie exclaimed suddenly. "Oh, how they can swim!" The two young gypsies had drawn near enough to Arthur for the children to measure their progress. "I never saw a girl swim like that," Laura said with a touch of envy. "She swims just like a boy." Arthur, his ears sunk below the level of the water, had apparently heard nothing. But now, suddenly, he threw himself on his side and paddling just enough to keep afloat, watching the approaching pair in amazement. On the burls came, their eyes fixed on Arthur, their expressions quite noncommittal. Arthur waited. Suddenly, a terrible thing happened. Silva threw up her hands and screamed. Timma, a little in advance, turned and swam to her rescue, but once he had reached his sister's side, she caught him about the neck. It was all over in a second. The two sank together. The children on the jetty shrieked. Maida burst into tears. Harold started out at once for the fatal spot. Rosie made as though to follow him. "Don't, Rosie," Laura said with sudden coolness. "You'll only be in the way." In the meantime, Arthur swam instantly for the spot where brother and sister had disappeared. He dived at once, staying under the water for what, to the frightened group on shore, seemed an incredible time. But he came up, filled his lungs with air, dived again. For the third time, he appeared on the surface. For the third time, he dived. Suddenly, many rods away on the top of the water appeared two heads, Silva's and Timma's. Simultaneously, Arthur came up gasping for air. The burls managed to wave a hand, broke into high jeering laughter, then swam rapidly towards the other shore. By this time, Harold had reached Arthur's side. Together, they started after the practical jokers, but both the boys were spent with their first long swim of the year. After a while, they turned and rejoined their friends on the shore. Can you beat that? Arthur demanded. His face had taken on the black look that rage with him always developed. Rosie's eyes darted lightnings. Maida had stopped crying and her eyes had changed too, not glowering like Rosie's. They had grown suddenly dark. Laura looked stupefied. Dickie had turned white. Great shadows jumped out under his eyes. That was the most dreadful thing I ever saw in my life, Maida asserted in a voice, almost a whisper. You might have drowned Arthur. I'll get even with them for that, Arthur said in a quiet voice. You wait. I don't blame you, Rosie declared. I'm so mad, I don't know what I wouldn't do. I don't believe they're worth taking any notice of, Laura decided contemptuously. Gypsies like that. Why don't you tell their aunt, Maida? I'd like to, Maida answered, but I guess I won't. I like Aunt Save too much. Anyway, Harold pointed out, it isn't anything that concerns them. It's all between us children. No, I wouldn't want any grown people to get mixed up in this at all, Arthur said. I wouldn't say anything about it to Granny Flynn or Mrs. Dorr. It'll only worry them, and nobody's the worse for it. We didn't do anything to be ashamed of anyway. Ashamed of? Rosie echoed stormily. You were only trying to save their lives. No, Maida agreed. I won't say anything about it. I think you're right, Arthur. The Burls had reached the opposite shore by this time. Before they disappeared into the woods, they raised their voices in a long, derisive shout. As Arthur listened, his face grew blacker and blacker. Do all the yelling you want, he called. I'll get even with you, my fine young gypsies. Chapter 8, Night. The women were too busy to take any notice of the children when they returned, except to ask them if they had a good swim. I feel like reading, Maida said with a determined air. She marched into the library. There's a book here I haven't read for a long time, at the back of the North Wind. She went on as though talking to herself. It's one of the loveliest stories I've ever read. I feel like reading it now. It's so cool. There's a great beautiful woman in it, the North Wind. Her voice melted into silence as her hand seized a worn brown book. She dropped into one of the big chairs, seemed to forget entirely about her companions. The others, partly because there seemed nothing else to do, followed her example. Oh, here's a journey to the center of the earth, Dickie announced joyously. I haven't seen it since Maida took it to Europe. He absorbed himself in the big, thick volume. Rosie and Laura contented themselves respectively with Little Men and Little Women, and Harold began for the third time Kidnapped. But Arthur found a newly published book describing the exploration of Africa in a flying machine. He pored over it, gradually became absorbed. It had been late afternoon when they returned. Nearly an hour drifted by. That coolness which announces the approach of dusk set in. Well, Maida said at last, breathing a long, relieved sigh. I got rid of my temper. If I hadn't took a book when I did, I'm sure I'd have burst into pieces. If everybody has read all he wants to, let's try the tennis court. They tried the tennis court, although only Maida and the two Lathrops played tennis. But to such good effect, and with so great a fascination, that they returned to it after supper. Arthur, as was to be expected with his coolness and game sense, progressed rapidly under Harold's instructions. The others found it the most difficult thing they had ever attempted. They were hot and tired when finally approaching dark made it impossible for them to see the balls. They adjourned to the tree room where, in hammock and chairs, they talked and talked. Gradually, the talk grew desultory, sank to an occasional silence. "I was rummaging about in the barn early this morning," Arthur said, out of the reflective quiet in which he had long been immersed, "and I found all kinds of things in a big chest. Baseballs and bats, football stuff and boxing gloves. Do you know how to box, Harold?" "No," Harold replied. "Never tried it." "Want to learn?" Arthur inquired. "I'll teach you. I'd like the practice." "Sure," Harold said. "When will we begin?" "Tomorrow," Arthur responded. "What do you want to practice boxing for, Arthur?" Rosie asked curiously. "Oh, I thought I might need it sometime," Arthur answered evasively. He smiled into the dark. "Say," Rosie burst out suddenly, "did anybody besides me get sunburned today?" "Well, I didn't mention it," Laura answered sleepily, "but I feel as if my face were on fire." Oh, Maida exclaimed contritely. "I forgot to warn you to be sure to wear hats this first day or two. Are you burnt, Arthur?" "To a cinder," Arthur declared, "but I've been burnt before. I don't mind it so very much." "And you, Dickie?" Maida went on. Dickie's answer was a grimace. "And Harold?" Maida continued in a despairing voice. "I shall be one big blister tomorrow," Harold prophesied grimly. "Oh my goodness," wailed Maida futilely. "It's all my fault." "Well, it's 8:30, she added after a pause. "According to rules, we can sit up until 9, but I'm going to bed now. I never was so tired in all my life." "I'm falling asleep where I am," Rosie admitted. "And as for Laura, she is asleep." This was the first day at the little house. Chapter 9. Plans. "Now," Maida announced at breakfast a week later, "we've had all the vacation we're going to get. At least all that the big six get. Tomorrow begins our work. Father said we could plan it ourselves how it was to be done, and unless our plans were bad ones, we could keep right on with them. Now I propose that, right after breakfast, you boys go to the barn and make a program of your work. We girls will stay here and make a program for ourselves. You remember what it is you're expected to do." Notwithstanding protests that they remembered everything, she recited briefly again to the boys the list of their duties. After breakfast, as directed, the big six divided. The boys proceeded to the barn. The girls settled themselves in the big, comfortable living room, began to discuss the work that they were to do. Rosie, in some inexplicable way, soon took control, was handling the situation in the practical, efficient way that was typical of her. "Do you know how to make a bed, Maida?" she asked. "No," Maida answered dolefully. "I never made one in my life. It looks easy, though." "It's easy to make a bed badly," Rosie said with emphasis. "How about you, Laura?" "Well," Laura replied slowly, "I have made one." Rosie groaned. "I know what it will look like," she commented. "Now I can make a bed," she boasted. "Right after we finish this, I'll take you upstairs and show you both. Now, how about cooking?" Maida looked aghast. "I never cooked anything in my life." "That's what I thought," Rosie remarked grimly. "How about cooking, Laura?" "I can make popovers, 1, 2, 3, 4 cake and cup custard," Laura stated proudly. "And, oh yes, fudge." "Is that all?" Rosie asked scornfully. "Yes," Laura admitted. "Can either of you make a fire?" Rosie went on. 2 meek no's were the answer. "Well, as far as I can see," Rosie decided, "we've got to begin at the very beginning. Now, I've been thinking this matter over, and it seems to me there's only one fair way of doing it, and that is for us to weed the flower garden all together every morning. Each one of us to take care of their own room." "Her own room," Maida corrected. She added roguishly, "I thought you were beginning to feel too important, Rosie." "All right, smarty cat, her own room. Then, when it comes to Floribel's day out, we'll take turns in planning the 3 meals. But every Thursday, one of us must have the day in charge. On that day, the other 2 are only assistants." "Rosie," Maida exclaimed, "I think you're perfectly wonderful. That seems to me to be absolutely all right. Don't you think so, Laura?" "Yes," Laura answered, equally enthusiastic. "I think it's marvelous." "Well then," Rosie began again, "let's begin to plan meals for this Thursday." They were deep in this interesting task when the boys returned from the barn. They compared plans. The boys' plan did not differ so very much from the girls', except that, when it came to the work in the vegetable garden, they had decided to weed in rotation. Also in rotation, they were to sprinkle garden and tennis court nightly, to roll the tennis court daily. Each boy was to make his own bed. There was a typewriter in the library, and they spent the next half hour typing out these plans and making as many copies as there were children. Then they pinned them up in their rooms. "Say," Arthur declared suddenly, "you girls have got to show us how to make a bed. I suppose I could make one after a fashion, but I never have. I don't know how to begin." "I do," said Harold unexpectedly. "I learned how to make beds last summer at camp. I'll show you." "Show us now," Arthur demanded. The 3 boys started in the direction of the barn. "Let's go too," Rosie whispered. "Isn't it a joke to think of boys trying to make beds? I'd like to see the bed after Harold has finished with it." The girls tagged the boys, followed them upstairs into the barn. At once, Harold began in the most businesslike way to strip the bed. It was apparent that on arising, he had pulled the covers back to air. Then, with swift, efficient movements, he began to remake it. "Goodness," Rosie exclaimed humbly in a moment. "I can't make a bed as well as that. I'm going to learn too." Indeed, the bed looked like a mathematical problem which had just been solved, and as Harold proceeded to clean up the room in the way he had learned at camp, the others followed him with respectful glances. Harold tidied the 3 chiffoniers and the 3 closets. When he finished, the room had a look of military perfection. "Now," he commanded, "Arthur, you make your bed, and Dickie, you make yours. I'll supervise the job." "I'm going right back to my room and remake my bed, Harold," Maida declared. "It looks as though somebody had driven an automobile over it." "I will too," admitted the humbled Rosie. "Think of having a boy teach you how to make a bed." The boys rejoined the girls after a while, and again they went over their plans. In the midst of it all, Granny Flynn came in to see what was keeping them so quiet. They showed her the typewritten schedules, and she approved them highly. They ought to work like a charm, she averred. And indeed, it seemed as though her prophecy were a true one. About the same hour the next morning, twin alarm clocks rang out, one in the barn, another in Maida's room. Very soon after, a sleepy boy, Arthur had volunteered for the first day in the garden, emerged from the barn. 3 sleepy girls from the house. They weeded busily for half an hour. In the meantime, another sleepy boy was rolling the tennis court which had been hosed the night before. Then came breakfast. Immediately after breakfast, rooms were made speckless. With the girls, this continued to be a kind of game. They not only prided themselves on keeping their chambers clean, but they actually tried to match the flowers they placed there to the chinches and wallpapers. "It's fun to take care of these darling rooms," Rosie declared again and again. "They're so little, I feel as though we ought to buy a doll's broom and a doll's carpet sweeper and a doll's dustpan and brush. I never saw such sweet furniture in all my life, and how I love the roof slanting down like that." "I feel that way too, exactly as though I were putting a doll's house in order," Laura coincided happily. As for the boys, they bothered with no flowers. Indeed, a military plainness prevailed in the barn. This, of course, meant also a military neatness to which no one of them was accustomed but Harold. Harold constituted himself critic-in-chief, and he proved a stern critic indeed. He would not permit the sheets on the bed to deviate 1 hair's breadth from perfect horizontality or absolute verticality. A bit of paper on the floor elicited an immediate rebuke. He even stipulated the exact spots on the chiffonier tops where brush, comb, and mirror were to be kept, and he saw that the other boys kept them there. The victims of his passion for military order had to roll their pajamas in a certain way and put them in a certain place. A similar neatness characterized the closets. Coats and trousers had to be hung on special hangers, ties on special hooks. As for bureau drawers, Harold maintained that there was a place for everything, and woe to Dickie or Arthur when everything was not in its place. Immediately after the rooms were done in the morning came errands. The first morning, Granny let the Big Six do all the marketing, even what could have been done over the telephone, so that they could get to know where the shops were. They proceeded on their bicycles with Maida for a guide. Maida took them to the post office, to the butcher, the grocer, the coalman, the woodman, the hardware shop, the ice cream establishment, even to the little dry goods shop and to the cobbler. She introduced them to all the village authorities. "After today," Maida explained, "we'll have to do only part of Granny's marketing for her, and only one of us need attend to it." "Oh, let's do it every day, and all together," Dickie burst out impulsively. "You think you'll enjoy that because it's new to you," Maida laughed, "but you'll soon get tired of it. No, we'd better take turns." Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday went by. More and more certainly, Granny Flynn's prophecy seemed on the way to be proved true. The twin sets of plans worked perfectly. It looked as though the summer were going by without a hitch. Then came Thursday, Floribel's and Zeke's day out. Chapter 10. Responsibility. Really, as Rosie pointed out, the work for Floribel's and Zeke's day out began the morning before. You had to make sure then that there was enough raw material in the house for 3 meals of the next day. Therefore, early Wednesday morning, before they went to market, the 3 girls sat down at the typewriter and worked out the program of their 3 meals. Rosie, you take charge of the first day, Maida urged. You've had so much more experience than Laura or me. Don't you think she ought, Laura? I certainly do, Laura agreed with conviction. Thank goodness. Breakfast is always easy. It's fruit and breakfast food and eggs. Thank goodness, too, that fruit grows already made. Just think how much work it would be if we had to cook oranges and peaches, or if we had to shell berries. And what a blessing milk is. How nice of the cow to deliver it all cooked. Well then, Rosie began, taking the situation in hand at once. Let's start with fruit. Let's have oranges. Oh, let's, interrupted Maida excitedly. I know a perfectly beautiful way to prepare oranges. You cut the skins into quarters and then into 8ths while they're still on the orange. You don't pull them off, but you turn them back so that the orange stands in the midst of petals of its own peel, just like a gold pond lily. All except Delia's orange, Laura put in. I noticed that Mrs. Dorr gives her orange juice, and after she has squeezed it, she strains it very carefully. All right, Laura, Rosie agreed again at once. You can attend to the oranges. I think we'd better have prepared breakfast food this first breakfast, Maida suggested. We're bound to make a lot of mistakes in cooking, but we can't hurt anything that just comes out of a box. Yes, you're right, Maida, Rosie agreed. Now, shall we have an omelet? I know how to cook omelets. No, I guess we'd better have boiled eggs. They're the easiest, and I don't want to make any mistakes the first day if possible. Well, that settles breakfast, Maida declared with satisfaction. Now, what are we going to have for dinner? I'd like to have a fish chowder, Rosie suggested. We haven't had one this summer. Most everybody likes chowder. And then, she added with a smile, it's the only thing I know how to cook. Then we'll have it, Rosie, Maida decided. I'll teach you how to make chowder if you like, Rosie offered. Oh, will you, Rosie? Maida asked ecstatically. I love fish chowder. I've never in all my life had enough. How I would enjoy making it. And then, Rosie continued, for dessert, we'll have bread pudding. It's the only pudding I know how to make. Laura drew a long breath. What'll we eat next Thursday? She asked in a serious tone. I don't know how to cook anything but popovers and custards and cake. Maida doesn't know how to cook anything at all. And you are cooking this first Thursday everything you know. Rosie sighed too. Well, we'll consider next Thursday when it comes, she decided wisely. And besides, Granny and Mrs. Dorr or Floribel will teach us how to cook anything. They said they would. And now we have to come to supper. Supper was not so easy for Laura as for the other two, because Rosie immediately decided that Laura should make some of her 1, 2, 3, 4 cake. The rest of the meal was to be bread and butter, some of the preserves left over from the year before, with which the house was richly provided, and great pitchers of milk. We've got to do the cooking for this whole day ourselves, Maida sighed. There isn't a thing in which the boys can help us." "No," Rosie admitted regretfully. "And I wanted to make them work too." "Next week," she added, "they'll be busy enough because we'll have ice cream and they'll have to turn the freezer." The girls pinned up their schedule of meals on the kitchen wall, set the alarm clock for an incredibly early hour, went to bed at 8 instead of 9, very serene in their minds. The record of their first day was probably as good and as bad as that of most amateur cooks. In the early morning, the little girls moved so noiselessly about the big kitchen and talked in such low tones that Mrs. Dorr said she had not heard a sound until the breakfast bell rang. The first 2 courses of breakfast went off beautifully. Then they discovered they had boiled the eggs 12 minutes. Granny declared that they must eat them because eggs were expensive. Perhaps it was to take away the sting from this mistake that Mrs. Dorr remarked that she had never seen oranges look so beautiful as these, in their curled golden calyxes. When it came to luncheon, there were mistakes again, but not such serious ones. Rosie's chowder was hot and perfectly delicious, only there wasn't enough of it. Rosie herself nobly went without, but the children clamored for more. On the other hand, she had made enough bread pudding for a family twice their size. Here the boys eagerly came to the rescue and demanded 3 helpings each. Supper was very successful. Granny Flynn and Mrs. Dorr congratulated Rosie warmly upon it. "Well, I didn't make any mistakes for this meal," Rosie said dryly, "because there wasn't anything that I cooked." However, Granny continued to praise the 3 tired little girls. "It's fine little cooks you'll make," she prophesied. In the glow that this praise developed, they washed and wiped the dishes, chattering like magpies, and then, following the impulse which emerged from that happy glow, they cleaned up Floribel's kitchen. They rearranged and redecorated to such good purpose that, the next day, Floribel said privately to Mrs. Dorr, "It sure does look beautiful, and I've never seen a kitchen like it, but I can't find a single thing." Sweet dreams, my friend. Sleep well.